So, I'd like to offer some reflections tonight on bringing our formal meditation practice into our life. And maybe just to make some connections first to the meditation that we just did. I think that oftentimes the meditation instructions we hear stop after pay attention to the breath. And we can kind of end up just sort of coming back to the breath again and again and again. And this creates a kind of distortion both in the meditation practice and also in how it translates into our life. It sets up a certain kind of expectation that somehow meditation is just about controlling our mind and pinning it on an object and somehow disconnecting from the rest of our life, when in fact, that process of settling the mind is just sort of the first phase of creating enough resources, stability, and strength inside to then open to everything else. So if we get past that first stage of that first set of instructions and actually hear more instructions, which is to open to the rest of our experience and notice what's happening, the next obstacle that we face in the meditation instructions is this instruction to observe, which is a profound instruction and a difficult process to abide by with integrity, because we want to mess with experience all of the time. We want to make it better. We want to fix it. We want to feel good. We don't want to feel this. So to just observe takes a lot of doing. But again, here too, if this is the only thing we do, we can end up kind of spinning, right? If you're observing something, but you're not balanced, then we just kind of go down. Or if we're observing, say, some pleasant fantasy about the future, but we're actually kind of getting involved in it a little bit, we end up feeding it. So this is where the third instruction that I was offering earlier in the meditation is important, which is to respond, right? So we're in relationship with what's happening. And sometimes when there's enough balance in the mind, we're just observing and learning from the unfolding of experience. And the stronger the mindfulness and concentration, the more deeply we can observe, the more powerfully we can understand the nature of experience and what it is to be human. But when those conditions aren't present, we might need to respond to what's happening appropriately to bring in some of these other factors like kindness and patience and compassion and courage and energy in order to rebalance. And so this instruction is really essential for our life when we think about the connection between our practice and the rest of our life. In our lives, we're not just observing, we're responding all the time to what's happening. And the question is, how are we doing that, right? Are we reacting automatically, habitually, or are we able to make clear, effective responses that are coming from a place of wisdom and love inside? So how we practice in the meditation will affect how it's showing up in our life. The meditation practice is only one aspect of the path that the Buddha taught. And the path as a whole is holistic. It's kind of redundant. The path is holistic. It's meant to transform our lives from the inside out. So if you look at the Noble Eightfold Path, this kind of summary of the Buddha's teachings, one way of understanding it is a certain kind of set of instructions for living, with specific pointers and recommendations on everything from how to train and cultivate the heart-mind to our work, our speech, our relationships, and our very understanding of our place in the world. If our meditation practice or our kind of contemplative and spiritual practice in general doesn't inform our lives, if it's only something that we do on retreat or at a certain time of day in a certain place, then what's its real value? What's its relevance? It's just another nice experience. So this feels even more important to me today, with so much change happening in our world so rapidly and so many overwhelming challenges and crises unfolding around the world, in our communities. How do we really bridge the gap between what's happening in our contemplative practice and the rest of our life? So this is what I want to explore together tonight. And the first thing I want to acknowledge and just suggest as a starting point is that part of being human means that there's often a gap. There's a gap between what we sense is possible, say for ourselves individually or for our society, and reality. There's a gap between our vision and where we are, between our values sometimes and what we're actually able to do, how we act in certain situations. We each, I think, can see this in different ways in our lives. One of the first times I noticed it was many years ago, when I started my practice, and I was living at the Insight Meditation Society, and I noticed that the very meaningful experiences I was having in meditation practice of feeling peaceful or calm or sending metta to all beings, feeling, very connected to a value of love and kindness, were not accessible even in the smallest of disagreements. I often tell this story when I teach communication, because it's one of the things that inspired me to learn more about communication practice. I would notice that when I was working in the kitchen, if I had a disagreement with one of the fellow cooks, it was very difficult to stay patient, to be loving and understanding, and not just try to assert my will and say I was right and get into arguments. And those same deep values of the meditation were even less accessible when I would talk to family members and often get into arguments there. So we see it in our relationships. Those of you who practice with me, or maybe you're on my email list, know that I had a child a year ago. So I'm a new parent. And this too has been a tremendously humbling experience to see the gap, right, between my aspirations and the reality, particularly in those first 6 months when my wife and I were so underslept and under-resourced, to see how quickly the patience runs out, how easy it is to get into arguments and spats. Sometimes in our lives, it takes a major loss or a significant change to be able to see the gap between what we hold most dear and true and how we are showing up. My father passed away very suddenly earlier this year. And one of the great lessons of his passing for me has been coming to terms with the ways that I was withholding love from him, because he wasn't taking care of himself. And it was so painful for me, because it was so hard to be close and in relationship with him and see him suffering. And I had kind of worked with that for years, practicing equanimity and forgiveness, taking space even at a certain point many years ago, and had definitely made progress and found more acceptance and equanimity. And yet there was this piece of recoiling a little bit inside that I wasn't fully aware of until he was gone, and then felt the grief and the remorse of that gap between what was true in my heart and what I was actually able to offer and realize in the relationship. So what do we do with that gap? What do we do with that gap in our world? When we see hunger, poverty, climate refugees, war, the ongoing effects of racism or structural violence, how do we relate to the pain of that gap between our values, our vision, and reality? A good friend and colleague and former mentor of mine, Mickey Kashtan, who's a nonviolent communication trainer, points out that oftentimes, if we are not conscious and careful, we'll try to fill that gap with unskillful things. So we'll ignore or avoid it. We'll try to fill it with distraction, with stimulation, with addiction, with depression, with apathy, with blame. We blame ourselves, we blame others, with busyness, eventually with burnout, because we don't have the capacity perhaps to tolerate or engage with the pain of that gap. So is this making sense so far, what I'm sharing? Okay. So this is the first suggestion, that there's often this gap between our heart and the world. So the next thing is, how do we relate? So rather than trying to fill or avoid or numb that gap in unskillful ways, how can we begin to relate to that with more awareness and skill? So one of the most powerful resources I think we have for this is compassion, is tenderness for the pain of that gap. To begin to accept that this is how it is right now. Not some absolute statement, but this is the truth of my experience, is that this is what I long for, and this is what is, and that distance hurts. And sometimes just to acknowledge that, to have some acceptance about it, can create a little bit more space, and to bring in a quality of tenderness for ourselves. And if we can't access it internally, then to imagine someone else bringing it in. An elder, a mentor, a grandparent, a spiritual or religious figure. As we start to do that, as we start to kind of honor the pain with compassion, something else can begin to emerge. We can sense the healthy longing underneath that gap. We can honor the beauty of what it is that we are longing for. The Buddha talked about a kind of healthy grief. That's the longing for awakening, for enlightenment, for our hearts to be free and whole. And I love that he talked about it that way, as a certain kind of pain, but a healthy one, because it motivates us to bridge the gap. There's a beautiful line from a Rumi translation that says, "The pain is the cure for the pain." It's like we do so much to try to avoid the pain, to not feel it. And in doing so, we rob ourselves of the very medicine that we need to begin to heal it. Because the reason it hurts is because we care. You see that? If we didn't care, it wouldn't register. So as we bring compassion or self-compassion, this quality of tenderness, we can begin to identify what is so beautiful in that longing. So this has the potential to connect us with aspiration, which is one of the sort of foundational qualities on the path to awakening, and in any movement for social transformation and change, the sense of where are we headed? What is the goal? Right? This is a kind of orienting principle for our life or for our communities. So to really ask oneself, what is our most noble aspiration? What is it that really matters to us? And this can be something great or small. This could be simply, I want to treat everyone I meet with kindness and respect. For me, to parent with attention and love and patience in every moment as much as possible. One of the things that's so remarkable for me about our son, who's just turned 1 recently, is like every experience and every interaction he's learning. So how am I showing up? Everything is learning for him. So what is our aspiration? Aspiration can orient us in a world that can feel so overwhelming. What's my North Star? And then when we feel overwhelmed or confused or lost, we can remember that aspiration. This is what I'm about right now. This is what I'm aiming towards right now. And come back to that deep longing inside. And it's just the clarity about that can help us begin to relate to that gap in a different way. So one of the things that was hardest for me in the first few months of our son's life was seeing when my patience would run out, which would happen often in the middle of the night, up every hour or so, right, with our son crying, needing a diaper, needing milk. And there were times when, if I was unable to soothe him and I was tired, I would run out of patience and I would get so angry inside because I felt so helpless. It was incredibly humbling and a little bit scary to see that anger arising in relation to this newborn that's so vulnerable and utterly dependent. And it wasn't until I really articulated for myself, I want to practice patience, that I was able to start to bridge the gap, that I was able to start to touch into a deeper well of strength and resources when the anger would arise, when I was feeling impatient, to remember that deep vow of, I want to practice patience. So there's this gap. How do we relate to it? Can we bring tenderness? Can we honor the pain? Can we connect with the longing, the beautiful, wholesome longing underneath the pain, and begin to connect with our aspiration? So this then brings us to really the heart of the matter, which is, how do we bridge the gap? What are our tools? What are our strategies to start to narrow that distance little by little? Just a note, kind of technically here, just a reminder that I'm not looking at the chat, so I see this little bubble coming up on my screen as some folks are commenting. And please save your comments or questions for the end, and Ileana will help to mediate the conversation there. So one of the essential things, I think, is to remember the core framework of the Buddha's teachings, which is that everything arises due to causes and conditions. When those conditions change, what has arisen changes. This is the heart of understanding in the Four Noble Truths, which is a kind of statement about the causes of suffering and the conditions that lead to the end of suffering. So the Four Noble Truths and the whole path to awakening work because of this fundamental sort of law of the universe, that everything is affecting everything else. And when certain conditions come together, there's a certain outcome, right? So if you have wood and oxygen and enough heat, you get fire. Fire only happens when those conditions come together. If those conditions change, there's no oxygen, it gets wet, the fire stops. I think you know what you think you get what I'm saying here. So the question then is, what are the conditions that can support us to bridge the gap? What are the conditions that help us to integrate holistically our deep values into our life? What conditions help us remember our intentions? What are the conditions that support us to, say, bear with discomfort, to step outside of our habits and do things differently? So one of the things that I learned during my time as a kind of novice monastic training for a few years was how much external support this path takes. The dominant paradigm in the West is so hyper individualistic, and then we come to this practice which seems very individualistic. It's like, I'm going to sit with my eyes closed and I'm going to meditate, right? And yet it's so hard to tame the mind, to understand this craziness that's happening inside. When you look at the monastic form that the Buddha set up, or even the lay communities that supported the monastics, there's a lot of structure. There are a lot of forms to hold the community and remind those on the path of their aspiration, of their commitments. So the Buddha emphasizes again and again throughout the teachings the company we keep. Who are we spending time with? And how are they influencing our mind? So when we think about the conditions that will support us to live the life we want to live, to create the world we want to create for future generations, I think one of the great tragedies of our times is this kind of split between the world of healing and spirituality and the world of social change. And the social change movements tend to look outwards only, and the healing and spirituality movements tend to look inwards only, when the reality is we need both. We need to be looking at the internal conditions of transformation and the external conditions for transformation and attending to both. So the Noble Eightfold Path provides a fairly robust template for beginning to examine this and really consider, okay, well, what are some of those conditions? So I'm not going to go through it a kind of, piece by piece, but I'll touch on different aspects of it, just as a way of structuring some of the reflections I have. So the path begins, in the sort of chronological order of it, with our view. And the view that our practice is our life. The sense of non-separation. It's not just about what we do on the cushion or when we go on a retreat or when we're reading or studying, but it's about all of how we're living. So one way to begin to bridge the gap is to just recollect this view, or even to nourish it if it's not there. What if your meditation, what if your contemplative life were all of your life, rather than just something you do at a certain time of day? How does that change the way you go grocery shopping? How does it change the way you talk to the person on the other end of the phone when you're in a corporate phone maze? How does it change the way you talk to the teller when you're frustrated about how long you've had to wait in line? How does it change your choices about how much news you take in, and when, and how, and where you get your media from? So a view is very powerful. It's how we look at ourselves in the world, and the way we look at something determines how we relate to it. So bringing forward this view that caring for my heart, realizing my potential, awakening, however you want to talk about it, is about everything in my life. that starts to open up a lot more opportunities for practice. So this is one tool we have, dissolving the sense of separation between our practice and our life. Another is simplifying the teachings and the practice down to one question. Am I suffering right now? Maybe two questions. Where am I holding on? Where am I resisting and controlling? Am I suffering? What's the cause? Where am I not in right relationship with the unfolding of life? So this opens up a whole new terrain for practice in our lives and gives us many more opportunities to start to bridge the gap. So this is about cultivating wisdom, our view, the kinds of questions we ask, and the relationship we have with what's unfolding, the different intentions we bring forward in our hearts. So just like that story I told about those early months of parenting, like bringing forward an intention of patience, bringing forward an intention of compassion to myself. These are ways of bringing wisdom into our lives. So the next section of the Eightfold Path is about our conduct in the world. And what I've always found so fascinating and powerful about this part of the Buddha's teachings is that he starts with speech. It's before any other form of action, and it's before the teachings on right livelihood, how we earn a living and work in the world. He starts with pay attention to your speech. Many of you who are familiar with my teaching or have sat retreats with me know that this is an area that I've spent a lot of time exploring, and that I teach a lot on is integrating contemplative practice into communication. I wrote a book on it. I have online classes on it. Because it's such a powerful arena for transformation and for nourishment in our lives. Our relationships determine to a large degree our quality of life, and it's our communication that determines the quality of our relationships. So if we're looking to bridge the gap in our lives, communication is one of the most powerful levers we have. We're communicating all the time, even when we're not talking to others. There's the internal dialogue, how we're treating ourselves. So making even one shift in your communication has an outsized effect on the rest of your life. I talked about my dad earlier. We grew so close over the years, which is why it hurts so much at the end to see that I was withholding something. And so much of that, why we were able to grow close, was because of the training I did in communication and being able to listen and connect and express myself. A very good friend of mine, known each other since we were 10 years old. We met in 5th grade, and we're still tight. Was interviewing for a job just the other day, and he and I have been in touch about the job interview process, and kind of bouncing ideas off me and so forth. And he sent me a text message just this past week when I was at Spirit Rock teaching the Brahma Vihara retreat, and said, "What are your top 3 tips for communication?" And I said, "You mean for your job interviews?" And he said, "Yes." And we had some conversation about communication in the workplace and things like this. So I found it kind of funny because my whole communication training is structured around like these 3 steps. So I was like, oh, I know I know this one. But I like the way I expressed it to him. And so I wanted to offer just a very brief teaching on communication tonight as one way of starting to bridge the gap in our relationships. So the first is to lead with presence. Those of you who've read my book or taken my classes, this is, that's familiar. There's the understanding that to communicate effectively, we need to be here first, because communication is about understanding each other. Even if we're just trying to get something done, we need to be able to understand each other. We can't understand anything if we're not present. So show up as much as possible. Learn how to keep showing up. Stay connected to your body and keep being available for connection. This is one way to practice in communication. Second, listen fully and check if you've understood. So much of the time in conversation when someone else is speaking, we're not actually listening. We're planning what we're going to say next, we're refuting what they're saying, or our mind's just wandering somewhere. So when you're listening, really listen. This is a beautiful way to express our meditation practice in our lives. Of course, when there's a lot going on, we might need to track what's being said. That's fine. Track what you need to so you can follow what's happening. But really trust that the more fully you listen, the better you're going to be able to connect and respond. Instead of trying to plan what's going to happen next. As soon as you start planning, you're not in the moment, and then you lose connection with the other person and with your own creativity and wisdom, because now you're trying to control the future by planning. As you listen, if you're not sure about something, check it out. Ask, are you saying this? Check if you've understood. Okay, that's the second tip. Listen fully, check if you've understood if you need to. The third tip is when you're speaking, less is often more. So say enough to convey what you want to convey clearly and let go of what's extra. Your words have more weight when they're fewer words with more sincerity. So take any one of these tips, take 2 or 3 of them to lead with presence, to really show up. When you're listening, just listen. Try to understand and check if you've understood if you're not sure. When you're speaking, less is more. Let your words carry their own weight. This can start to transform your conversations. It can start to transform your relationships. It can even transform your relationship with yourself if you practice it wholeheartedly. So this is a very powerful way to start to bridge the gap, is by attending to our connection with others. I've already mentioned choosing wisely who we spend time with, because our hearts and minds are so impressionable. Some of you know I have a new book coming out in the fall that's kind of adjacent to the topic I'm talking about tonight. It's well, maybe not. It's about how do we translate our practice into our life as a whole, and really looking at that also in relation to social change. And one of the things that I was able to learn a little bit about and research during writing the book was some of the academic research that was done on the civil rights movement, and particularly the Freedom Summer in, I think it was 1964, when many students from the North went down south to help register Black voters. And this one researcher, I'm forgetting his name right now. I want to say Daniel Hunter, but I think it was someone else. Discovered was that what made the difference, why some people chose to take that really high risk of getting on a bus and going down south and really risking their lives to do this, was that they had been involved in other forms of activism that were much lower risk earlier and had developed strong ties with people in the community. It was through the relationships and the association with what's known as low risk, low cost activism that they made the choice to engage in high risk, high cost activism because of relationship and connection. So who we spend time with matters. It affects our choices. It affects our worldview. It also affects our opportunity to learn, because we learn from one another. So one of the things that I've will be forever grateful for in my own life is the time I've been able to spend with teachers, meditation teachers, and what I've learned just by being around them. There are teachers all around us in our life. If we know how to see them, if we know how to listen to them. So another thing that I practice and value a lot is receiving feedback, giving feedback and receiving feedback, because it's one of the ways we learn. We can't see what we can't see, but other people can. And if we're lucky, they'll tell us. One of the analogies that I like to use that I've heard from others, didn't make this up, in teaching about feedback is it's like telling someone that they've got something, between their teeth. Have you ever gone through the day and, you get to the end of your day and finally someone tells you you've got something there and no one told you all day? So receiving feedback is kind of like that. It's like someone's telling you, you might want to take a look at this. I think others are experiencing you in this way, and I'm guessing it's not your intention. I'm guessing it's not how you want to show up. Can we receive that as a gift? That takes a lot of strength. We have to be really rooted in our own goodness. To trust our heart to be able to take something in non-defensively. And to know the difference, to know what's accurate and what's not ours, and to just let it be there. This is another really powerful tool that we have to bridge the gap, is to listen for our teachers in life. And sometimes that teacher is a small child, sometimes it's a friend, sometimes it's someone that you consider an enemy. But there's something to learn there if we're willing to receive it, if we're willing to be open to it. So we've talked a little bit about view, how we think about our life, seeing our whole life as our practice, paying attention to where we're suffering. We've talked about relationships and communication and feedback as ways of bridging the gap. The last area of the Eightfold Path is the training in meditation, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. And this is based on the understanding that we can shape the heart, that we can train the mind, that our inner life is not fixed, but actually can grow. And that every day is an opportunity to do that. We're making conscious choices every day, or we're making choices every day. When we make them consciously, we can start to align what we're doing and how we're living more with our values. So we can learn to cultivate more gratitude. We can learn to live with more joy. We can learn to live with more patience. Every quality that we want to cultivate, every trait in the heart that we recognize as a valuable inner resource, it takes time to develop. It takes intention, practice, and a certain amount of creativity. So knowing one's own strengths, knowing what we're good at, and knowing where we need to improve, what we want to get better at, knowing our own shortcomings, the qualities that we recognize are not becoming, that we would like to stop feeding, and which harmful qualities we don't engage in, either because we've already overcome them or they're just not a problem. They're just not there for us. This is known as the four great efforts in Buddhism. So the strengths that you already have, make sure you keep nourishing them. The ones that you haven't cultivated, bring them online. The shortcomings that are there, learn how to disengage, turn the volume down. The ones that you're not engaged with, like if you don't gamble, don't start. Right? If you're not addicted, don't start. It's like the things that you're not doing that are harmful, great, keep going with that. The more we do this, the more we make choices every day to develop and deepen our strengths, the more inner resources we have to meet the changes and the challenges of our lives and our world. And that helps us to start bridging that gap. So as soon as we start to engage any of these methods, and this list, of course, is not exhaustive. There are many other ways we can practice and bridge that gap. But as soon as we start to acknowledge it and make an effort, we can sense that we're at least moving in the right direction. And that brings energy. That brings faith. It brings confidence. It brings joy. Because we know we're going in the right direction, and we keep walking toward the goal. The last piece I want to share, specifically around the choices we make, is how are we responding? So coming back full circle now to the meditation. So how are we responding? There's too much need in the world for us to do everything, and there's too much need in the world for us to do nothing. Know what's yours to do. For each of us, know what's ours to do. And then to act, to respond. Whatever it is within your purview. There's so much that we can't affect, but there's also so much that we can. So to just listen and be clear about that. And then trust the process. Trust the process of moving in the right direction without needing to know when or where or how we'll get there. So thank you so much for your kind attention. It's been a real pleasure to share and spend the time together. As we say in the Dharma, take what's useful, and the rest, you can just leave it aside.